Russia supplied 40% of Europe's natural gas last winter. Things have changed. Since the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has shut down pipelines, and the European Union now says it will ban all oil imports from Russia by December. The repercussions are significant and growing as winter approaches. With us to examine those in Boston, Massachusetts, Craig Kennedy, associate at Harvard University's Davis Center for Eurasian and Russian Studies, writing a history of Russia's oil industry and a former vice chairman at Bank of America in London. And in Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance and Innovation. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
All right, so before we begin, let's read a few quotes to set this discussion up. Russia has used its gas supplies as a weapon to foster an energy crisis next winter. That's the EU Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson in September. Inflation is soaring and rocketing energy costs have raised the prospect of a cold, dark winter. Europe stands at the brink of recession. That was in the Associated Press last month. And then Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, said in July, "We are in the middle of the first global energy crisis. The world has never witnessed such an energy crisis in terms of its depth and consequences." He then goes on to say this winter in Europe will be very, very difficult. Very stark picture as to what Europe will be facing in the next couple of months. I want to get your takes, both your takes on this. Besma, I'll come to you first. How would you characterize what Europe is facing or potentially could face this winter?
Well, one thing, we don't know what kind of winter it's going to be. I mean, if it was anything like the summer, which saw heat waves and drought, this is, of course, this is happening at a time where climate change is a crisis of its own. It will be very, very devastating for Europe. As we saw in all things in the summer, this lack of electricity meant, rationing in some cases, shortages. We know already of factories that have had to shut down. Some businesses are being clever and sort of using off-peak hours, changing their working hours completely. I mean, there are lots of really interesting policy ideas out there and solutions, and certainly no shortage of effort, but it's just the absolute lack of supply that is just making things much more difficult. And of course, what this means is that Putin feels very emboldened. And I think he realizes that one way to get at the heart of Europe is to really try to freeze them into submission. And whether or not he wins and achieves this goal is really going to be about how resilient can the Europeans be.
Greg, I'll get your take on that as well.
I think Bosma summed it up well, that this really boils down to a question of European resiliency and European resourcefulness. But I think it's also important to point out that this is a premeditated use of gas as an energy weapon. This wasn't in response to some action that was taken by Europe after February 24th. Russia started to draw down gas supplies going into Europe months before the invasion in an effort to try and create the sense of energy scarcity in Europe in hopes that that would keep the Europeans off sides once his invasion went forward. I think it's also important to point out that Europe is taking efforts to try and relieve some of the immense pressure that's going to come on households through subsidies. The Germans are rushing to try and put in place temporary liquefied natural gas facilities that would allow them to take more resources from elsewhere. But it really is a race against time. And some of it does come down to a question of how much demand will there be, and how effective will the Europeans be in conservation measures.
I'm hoping I can get you in sort of Vladimir Putin's head and help me understand here. How should we understand Putin's strategy here when it comes to natural gas? All right, let's go to Craig there.
So, sure. Really, Putin is looking at this not simply as a question of natural gas. It's a question of energy more broadly. He holds two very big cards. One is gas to Europe and his ability to really create turmoil in the gas markets there. But the other one is oil to the rest of the world and his ability to also create a sense of panic or crisis. We've seen him play the gas card already. And to a certain extent, that's an act of desperation. It means that he hasn't been able to stop the Europeans from backing, or the West more broadly from backing Ukraine, and he's having to up the pressure. The thing that is really worrying him now is what happens if the oil sanctions go forward in December and threaten his revenue stream from oil. So expect him in the coming weeks to also start trying to create a sense of panic in the oil markets, perhaps by drawing down export volumes going into the rest of the world.
We'll come back to the oil, but Besma, I want to talk to you about natural gas. This is a significant source of revenue for Russia. Is Putin shooting himself in the foot by sort of the stunts he's pulling?
I'm afraid he's not hurting. I mean, I think we need to be really, really clear-eyed about this. Certainly, yes, the volume of production or export has decreased, but the price has gone up. And so, in some accounts, we saw that actually, and even the Russian economy minister even boasted that, revenue is going to go up by an additional 40% on next year. So they don't feel like they're hurting on the financial side. And while I do think that, there is going to be increased global pressure on Russia, the reality is there's lots of potential buyers out there who are willing to take Russian oil. And we look at India, we look at, even Turkey, similarly, we see China as well, quite interested in Russian oil. And even in some of the cases, I think in India as well, they're reselling it at a profit. There is a lot of willing buyers of Russian oil out there. And as much as I think the West is aligned, and certainly I think there's a lot of determination and will to sort of make Putin hurt, the challenge is that much of the rest of the world just is not willing to sort of play by the same game. It's not the same environment that we had, I think, 10 years ago, when there was a lot more sort of international coalescing around some sort of joint, messaging here. This is really the world willing to continue to buy Putin's oil. He's not hurting. He's consolidated his power internally. His greatest, if you will, opposition at the moment are hyper-nationalists who want him to double down and be even more forceful in the occupation and invasion of Ukraine. So this is really the heart of it. And I'm not suggesting that the sanctions aren't hurting the average Russian individual. That's true. But the Russian people themselves are extremely resilient. They're quite, unfortunately, used to this sort of awful regime in place and have learned how to accommodate. And I think that really means that Russia and Putin himself feels very much emboldened to continue the policy of using energy as a weapon and continue to try to basically blackmail Europe into submission.
All right, I want to talk a little bit more about the individual European. In that sense, European gas prices are 6 times higher than they were at this time last year and 14 times higher than they were 2 years ago. And Craig, I want to ask you, and I want to ask you both, start with you, Craig, can Europe make it through winter with zero Russian natural gas?
Well, they'll have to. That's what it comes down to. That's what it will come down to, because Russia will continue trying to maintain maximum pressure. It's Putin's best strategy at this point. And this is going to cause a great deal of pain for Europe. Europeans will be paying much higher electricity prices at home, gas prices at home. I lived in London for decades, and I understand how high energy prices are there already compared to North America, and now they're going to be much higher. But I think coming back to something that was said a moment ago in terms of what Putin is hoping to achieve, in the near term, he is going to cause a greater turmoil in the markets, higher prices, and that will, in the short run, mean more revenues for Russia. But the problem is the gas weapon is a weapon you can use once and hope that it works. And his hope is that the West will back off from its support of Ukraine and back off from oil sanctions going forward, and that Putin will be in a much stronger position in terms of being able to maintain revenues. The problem is, if it doesn't work, if the Europeans hold firm, despite all the difficulties, then Russian gas to Europe is history. And the problem is, Russia's infrastructure for exporting gas is primarily oriented toward Europe. And this is something that you cannot change quickly. It takes many years and billions of dollars of investment, and by the way, Western technology as well, to build new pipelines going to potential Asian demand. So that Russian gas will get stranded and will no longer be generating revenues. The real question becomes, what happens with Russian oil?
We'll get to that for sure. Besma, I want to get your take on sort of what Craig said there. What is the impact for Europeans? Should we be expecting blackout? Should we be seeing, what could it potentially look like on the grounds there?
Yeah, I think you can't rule that out, and especially Germany. I mean, just as Craig noted, this mutual dependency really is about gas and about pipelines. They do have an ability to export some LNG, but just not nearly as much. So that may, in fact, be the long-term strategy of Russia, is to find more markets and more capability, increase their capability also for LNG. But that pipeline, particularly to Germany, and Germany's vulnerability and dependency on Russia, is the big issue that's structural and may not change, and clearly is not a quick fix, because all things LNG, particularly the facilities and terminals needed to build those, take time. It's not an overnight thing. But to the broader point in terms of how this is going to hurt Europe and the average European, it's going to hurt. I mean, I don't think you can ignore that. And this is what really Putin is banking on. You have countries like Italy that have an election coming up. You have a number of countries with, far right nationalists who are very much, looking to Brussels and the European Union as now, the scapegoat for all their problems, saying that, this is all about the energy market that the European Union controls over the rights of state sovereignty. And it's playing into that us versus them narrative that the populists absolutely thrive on, and that Putin is actually feeding. I mean, he actually funds some of these parties and certainly emboldens them. So it's really quite interesting. I think it's not just about the economic fallout of all this, price rises, but it's also the political fallout that we need to watch out for in Europe. These are countries that have strong populist nationalist parties that don't support the West on liberating Ukraine, that have completely bought the propaganda disinformation that Putin is offering, and increasingly are frankly winning at the polls. And so that fracturing within Europe is exactly what Putin is trying to do. And unfortunately, democracy as it is means that we may in fact find some of these people voted into office.
Craig, I'm hoping you can follow up on what Besma said. Talk about political fallout. What exactly does that look like?
I think Basma summed it up very well. Putin has been trying to convince Europeans not only that the energy crisis is a result of bad policy in Brussels toward Ukraine, but he's also trying to argue that this is part of Europe's ill-conceived program for transition to a green economy, and that there's been massive underinvestment in oil. There hasn't been enough embracing and appreciation of what Russia has to offer, and that Europe only has itself to blame for this. But let's make no mistake about it. While Europe may have made itself vulnerable by becoming overly dependent on Russian gas, it's Putin that threw the match onto the Kindle. It's Putin who has decided to shut the gas off as a way of as weaponizing it. And now the challenge for European politicians is to convince their population that they are part of the struggle against Russia alongside Ukraine, and that it's Putin that's causing this and not bad policies in Brussels.
All right, let's talk a little bit about what Europe is doing to help sort of ease the crisis that potentially could come in winter. You talked a little bit about it, Craig, off the top. I'm hoping to get your take. What exactly can we see in terms of prices for natural gas for Europeans?
So prices have been volatile, to say the least. They've been easing a bit in recent weeks. A lot will depend on the amount of demand destruction going forward. If we see recession starting to ease in, as most people are predicting in Europe, that means that energy demand will go down. And therefore, even though we have smaller supply, prices will ease. We also see that Europeans are being more successful than most people expected in replenishing their gas storage facilities in Europe. They're 6 or 8 weeks ahead of where they would normally be. And while Basma is absolutely right that this sort of infrastructure generally takes a long time, there are a few quick fixes. They may not come in time for this winter, but they are going to provide the prospect of more diversification of gas supplies going into during 2023. I have in mind, in particular, these 5 floating regasification facilities that Germany is trying to put in place, and it's basically a way to bring gas from Qatar, from Australia, on ships. In liquid form, supercooled, then to regasify it and run it into Europe to replace lost Russian gas. But even as quickly as Europe is trying to move now, it probably won't be in time to ease the pressure this winter.
Basma, I want to follow up with you. You know, the EU has proposed putting on a price cap on Russian gas imports to limit sort of the energy inflation. Is that a source of ease or a solution to this issue as well?
I mean, somewhat, yes. Certainly it'll help in the short term. And there's even other ideas of even putting price cap on some renewable energy companies and then sort of redistributing that profit, excess profit, as they call it, to the people, to the consumers and businesses. That's one solution, certainly. The big challenge, of course, is clean energy is where we need to go. It's obviously the most, I think, the right answer in that way. It's the right policy decision, but those take time. They're capital intensive. So as Craig noted, LNG facilities are being built in Germany because Germany is probably the most vulnerable. But those things take time, certainly. And, there are countries in Europe, think of Portugal and Spain, which have done a fantastic job of actually being ahead of the game here and not being dependent on other countries by making sure that it does have the LNG facilities and able to source it. And the United States today is one of the largest producers, if not the largest producer in natural gas, and that's opening up lots of opportunities. I mean, Qatar they're a bit at their absolute spare capacity. They don't have any more to give. It's not really, I think, an option. There was a lot of hope, I think, with the Biden administration in going and talking to the Qataris to try to get them to put more on tap. OPEC, of course, I think is another part of the solution. But there again, we saw their September meeting, despite the hope that Biden had in going to Saudi Arabia and making that whole visit to MBS and taking a hit, frankly, in terms of his public or his PR and his reputation. It's just not enough. There's just don't have enough capacity. And it's been a hot summer in the Middle East, and so there's also a lot of domestic demand, similarly for oil and gas, for electricity to run air conditioners. So it really is also a global supply crunch. I mean, this is happening at the worst time. It's not just about Russian oil. There's just a supply crunch, even without bringing in the Russian oil and gas dimension, and then add to that. And of course, you have the situation that we're in right now.
Greg, if we were to look at today, right now, who's winning the energy war right now?
Well, right now, it would appear that Russia is winning the energy war. They are flush with hydrocarbon revenues. They seem to have Europe in a panic. And many people in the market think that sanctions on Russian oil won't work. So I think if you looked at it today, just on the superficial appearance of things, you'd say Russia is. But if you roll the tape forward, I think the story changes quite a bit.
Craig, you did say looking down the line. I do want to follow up with Basma. The energy historian Daniel Yergin said that all this completely obliterates Russia's credibility as a reliable natural gas supplier. Looking forward a few years down the line, has Russia just lost the entire European market?
I think they'll never forget this, and I hope they don't. They really need to wake up, particularly Germany. All that fanfare about Nord Stream 2, clearly now I think people have woken up finally to the reality that, you cannot be that dependent on Russia. Angela Merkel's strategy, unfortunately, failed on Russia. I mean, that's the one, I think, element of her foreign policy that was flawed in my view. So, yes, I think Europe is waking up. They will never be dependent on Russia again. Putin and the regime, it's, I think, very much consolidated its power. It's not looking like it's going to crumble anytime soon. So it has to invest in finding alternatives. Clean energy is the way to go, but certainly finding ways of ensuring that there's more LNG able to come into the country. The entire industrial belt of Germany is very dependent specifically on natural gas. I mean, this is yet another challenge that they face. So we know that Germany is the industrial powerhouse of Europe, and without natural gas, they're not going to be able to continue to grow. And so there's also a looming recession here that we need to think about or talk about in terms of what's going to happen for Europe too.
Craig, I want to come to you. I said I would come back and talk oil with you. Europe plans to ban most Russian oil by December 5th. Do you think this will happen? Markets seem to say otherwise, but is that December 5th a for sure target?
Mm-hmm. So there are two components to the ban. One is that Europe will stop buying Russian oil and oil products. And Europe has, for the last 50 years, been the primary market for Russian oil and oil products. Its refineries, its pipelines, all of its energy infrastructure, not just for oil, but for gas, have been primarily oriented toward Europe. But Europe has also said that they're going to use what powers they have, and the G7 are backing them up, as well as some other countries, to prevent Russia from being able to export its oil to other countries. Now, I think this is something that's been deeply misunderstood by the market. There's this belief that Europe doesn't really have the ability to prevent Russia from selling oil to India and China and elsewhere. And for some of its export volumes, that's the case indeed. But what people, I think, have missed is how Russian infrastructure works. Oil relies on infrastructure just as much as gas does. And part of that infrastructure is the global tanker fleet. And Europe actually does, not simply through its control of most of those tankers, or at least most of those tanker owners are domiciled in Western countries, but also through its utter domination in financing and insuring of those tankers to effectively take most of the global tanker fleet away from Russia's oil industry. And the problem for Russia is that it has a very small fleet. It's only able to export 15, maybe 20% of Russia's current export needs. And so Russia is going to find itself unable to continue delivering anything like the volumes of oil that it does today. And so if you're a buyer in India that suddenly had a windfall of cheap oil, 1 million barrels a day over the last 6 months, and these sanctions suddenly kick in, and you go to your Russian supplier and say, where's my oil? They'll say, well, I don't have the tankers to do it. They're not saying that yet, but that's what will happen if Russia doesn't agree to sell at this price cap. The price cap allows them renewed access to the infrastructure they need to ship their oil.
From what I gather, you're saying that this energy war is won on oil, not at natural gas.
Historically, Russia's revenues from oil have been far greater than that from gas. Oil revenues are the glue that holds the Putin regime together. If you looked at just oil revenues on the eve of the war, the export revenues going into Russian state coffers were enough to fund 70–80% of this year's Russian budget. They're huge. They're strategic. And if they are slashed, it's going to create, it's going to put Russia at a big disadvantage going forward. And the infrastructure needed to move that oil also takes years to build.
Besma, I was going to say, I see you nodding. I was hoping to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I think looking at the insurance industry is really, really key here. And that still is very much Western dominated. So that is really very important here. I agree with that. The challenge, though, of course, is that we've seen a lot of shippers actually, reflag, take the oil illegally. I'm looking at Greek shipping industry that's, I think done a few things that were a bit not unconventional, let's say, on the border of illegal. So there's a lot of, I think, illicit oil that's going to find its way on the market. And sure, absolutely agree with Craig that, the pipelines in terms of getting Russian oil out is limited, but they are also building on that. They're very, very conscious of that dependency now, and do want to see how they can get more of that pipeline oil, particularly into China. And I think there's a lot of receptivity, of course, with China today to do so. And we've seen this really strong relationship building between President Xi and Putin. So I think that's really something for us to watch. I think, look, we do know that, Russia also is very, very powerful in OPEC plus. I don't think we can ignore that. Russia has had a very good relationship with OPEC. OPEC plus is literally born to include Russia. And I wouldn't be surprised if some very interesting, backroom deals are happening, really to, again, circumvent these kinds of sanctions. I don't think we can underestimate that. And again, even though countries like Saudi Arabia tend to put out these, very colorful types of statements suggesting that they're going to keep preserving oil stability and work with the West, I think they're doing a lot of backroom deals that, frankly, I don't think we know all the types of ways that we're going to see Russian oil circumventing the markets that we know of.
Craig, I'm going to come to you. We have about 30 seconds or so left. I do want to ask, there's a lot of conversation as to what is the end goal here, and what does a victory actually look like? And I want to ask you, does Putin lose the energy war if Europe makes it through the winter?
I think he's in a much weaker position. And I agree with Besma that there will be a lot of leakage in the sanctions. Russia is very good at finding workarounds and ways to subvert sanctions. But the challenge that Russia faces is one of scale. The oil exports that Russia has are massive. And try as you might to try and hire every shadow tanker that's currently serving the Iranians into Russian service, it's not going to be nearly enough to maintain anything like the levels they have right now. And that's the problem that they face. They are desperately working at workarounds, and they're finding it's much harder than they would have thought. This has caught them very much off guard, and it's creating a real issue for Putin.
Craig, Besma, thank you so much for your insights. Really, really great stuff. Thank you so much for joining us on the program tonight.
Thank you for having me.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.